Right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome back to this breakout session as part of the European Employment and Social Rights Forum. You're here for the skills needs for future jobs and the digital, green, and demographic transition session. My name is Anna Gumbau. I'm a journalist and event moderator here in Brussels, and I will be delighted to be guiding you in this session. So I think the title of the event, the title of the session says everything. As we navigate the profound shifts around the twin green and digital transitions, as well as the ongoing demographic changes, the labor market is evolving rapidly. New jobs are emerging, traditional roles are transforming, and the skills required to thrive in these dynamics are shifting. So in today's session, we will be exploring new evidence on the trends, on the occupations of the future, employment trends, and how these transformations also impact working conditions, training, and educational needs. And our discussions will be grounded in fresh insights from the recent data and research that will be presented here very shortly. So I invite you to engage through your social media in this session. You have the hashtag EU Social Forum, in which we encourage you to be using throughout the session to share any insights, any quotes that struck you from today's event, any thoughts you may have from this session. And the way that this session is going to go, so we are first going to have two presentations on different new evidence and new research on employment trends and skills need for the digital and green transitions. And then we will be commenting here in a panel discussion with different experts across sectors and across stakeholders. So let's get this started. I'm delighted to be welcoming our first one of our speakers here on stage. I'm inviting on stage the team leader at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, Matthias Weitzel. Welcome.
Thank you, Anna. I'm presenting today some work that we have done at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and it's been done in collaboration with colleagues at the DG Employment, so it's collaborative work. We started a while ago, and it has been first featured in the Employment and Social Development in Europe report in 2023. We have now converted it or put on it. We are hoping to put this out as a Fair Transitions working paper fairly soon. And in this work, we're looking at the green transition, so Europe's way of decarbonization. And in particular, we're trying to estimate how many workers we need in two sectors that are really key to that transition, and what it would take to equip them with the skills that they need. So we want to do that, but before that, I'll start a bit broader with the notion that the green transition actually affects all sectors. So the pathway to climate neutrality by the middle of the century is not having an effect on single sectors, but it's affecting the entire European economy. But of course, it's not affecting all sectors equally. For example, there are some sectors that may be facing with a reduced number of jobs. Think about coal mines, think about fossil power plants that may need to shrink in this transition, but workers in those sectors, they may possess some skills that are actually in high demand in other sectors. And yesterday we heard about mapping of skills, and this is maybe really important to enhance the transfer of skills of people across sectors. But sometimes this may be hampered, as research shows, that this is not just a move across sectors, but potentially also a move across locations. So you move to a new sector, but you need also to change your place of work. So this may make the transfer a bit more challenging. There's other sectors that are facing a changing environment of how they operate. Yesterday we had Renault here, so the automotive industry is clearly a sector that is transitioning when thinking about the internal combustion engine to electric vehicle transition. So for some workers in this sector, there may not be much of a transition, but for others, clearly it makes a difference whether you design or manufacture an electric vehicle as opposed to an internal combustion one. And finally, there are some sectors that will see a clear increase in demand. under the green transition. So here, renewable energy, for example, plays a key role as we need to scale up the deployment of renewable energy in Europe to reach European climate targets. And today I'll focus mainly on the last case, but first I'll present some findings that are a bit more general and also apply to other sectors. It's clear that the green transition has impacts on labor markets, and there's already a number of EU initiatives also on the human capital side of this green transition. So the Net Zero Industry Act, for example, touches on that. And yesterday we had the presentation of the Union of Skills, and that really is looking into this dimension as well. But it's still an open question somehow. How many jobs do we actually need in different sectors? And what are the skills that are required for these workers? And while investment needs in physical capital, such as wind turbines, solar panels, heat pumps, and so on, are quantified and discussed broadly, the investment needs in human capital are less prominent in these discussions, but they're actually quite relevant to accomplish the transition. So, as I mentioned before, some sectors are more affected by others, and here we look at some sectors that we think they're transforming sectors. So we count here manufacturing, which includes the automotive industry. We count construction, which includes, say, energy-efficient buildings. But we also look at transport, waste, energy, and mining sectors. And these sectors account for about 30% of the EU workforce, and I'll present some further indicators that describe trends in these sectors. Interestingly, in 2019, so prior to COVID and energy crisis and disturbances, all of those sectors had an inflow of workers coming from other sectors. So they were drawing in more workers coming into those sectors than the other way around. The only exception here is the mining sector, for which the workforce has been declining over a couple of years. And we also see that there must be some overlap of skills in those sectors, because when we look at the Eurostat's labor force survey, we see that there are workers moving across those sectors. And arguably, these sectors that I mentioned here are quite broad, but it's actually not so easy to get a good picture of higher granularity. So as a researcher, well, having more data would be really helpful to better understand these dynamics and to have a better understanding and anticipation of these transitions at the labor markets. Still, even at that level, we can find some interesting results when we look at these sectors. So here, as shown on the right-hand side, we have the distribution of male and female, and you see that those transitioning sectors are actually quite male-dominated. So women actually are just short of 1/4 of the workforce in these sectors, despite the fact that they have increased their share over the past decade. So on the left-hand side, we have the age group in this. And when we add the European averages in these yellow icons, one can compare this, and this is a bit more meaningful. So you can see that these sectors really stand out in terms of the gender distribution, but not so much in the age distribution. Maybe slightly fewer younger and older workers, but roughly overall the same pattern. Where does age structure play a role? Well, if it comes to the probability of moving to different sectors. So here I colored the sectors, and the brighter colors indicate these are workers that are more likely to transition to other sectors. So here you can clearly see that this probability declines with age. So younger workers might find it more difficult, more easy to come to transition between different sectors, potentially also adjust to changing nature within a sector. So when it comes to the transitions and to manage those, it's important to take into account the age structure of sectors and to take into account that older sectors may not be as flexible as younger ones. We can also use this transition data not to look at transitions across sectors, but also transition into employment or unemployment. And we see, for example, that workers in the energy-intensive industry are more likely to stay employed compared to sectors that are other sectors in the economy. So it may be meaning that they have a skill set that's a particularly high demand in the economy. Looking at the individual sectors, one can also see some clear differences across those sectors. So here, for example, when it comes to the proportion of workers that have recently done a training, and this fraction is much higher in the energy sectors, which is shown in the orange bar or orange line at the top. We also see there is an increasing trend over time. So the training on the jobs, acquiring new skills and capability becomes more important over time. And here we're looking at a sector that's clearly affected by the transition. So that, I think, is a good point to go deeper into that sector. So here we're asking how many jobs do we actually need in two sectors that are key for greening the energy system, so the wind and solar deployment, in order to reach the EU's climate target in 2030. Obviously, there's other sectors that are also important in the green transition. So we see this rather as a pilot to start here and to test some methods and then potentially expand that to other sectors and identify where we would see additional growth in jobs and potentially identify additional labor shortages. But back to our question, how many jobs do we need? So when it comes to deployment of wind and solar, we estimate that we would need about 130 to 145,000 additional workers by the end of this decade, in addition to those that are already in that sector. To arrive at this number, we've used energy models that are looking at existing EU climate and energy policies to see where we would arrive in terms of capacity employment, how many gigawatts of solar and wind would we need, and then we translate that into different types of jobs. So here we look at construction, services, transport jobs. So construction jobs actually account for more than half of the jobs in those sectors. But also services comes in at the as a close second. And the reason for this is that there is jobs in planning, in permitting, in finance. So there is actually quite a number of white-collar jobs in those sectors as well. So important to note here that we are actually excluding the number that is related to building the equipment, partly because, for example, in solar, a big fraction of that equipment is actually imported into the EU, so the jobs are not really in Europe. And to train those 145,000, we estimate that we would need to mobilize about 1.1 to 1.4 billion euros to be spent as investment in skills. And I'll get back to that to discuss the magnitude in a second. But first, where do we expect these additional jobs for wind and solar deployment to occur in Europe? So here we see, relative to the overall working force in the different member states, that we expect most additional workers in those countries where we expect an increase in the deployment of wind and solar compared to what we had as deployment in the period 2021 to 2023, which we use as a baseline period. So countries that are replacing their fossil fuels in electricity are expected to increase their share, and therefore additional jobs are required. We're not considering here the national energy and climate plans. So this would be specific plans in countries that would look into how many wind and solar, for example, they would plan to do in 2030, because we don't have all of the plans yet. So this could potentially change the numbers. But also, these numbers could be affected by how these targets are actually achieved. For example, if you build a big solar plant, utility scale, it's much less labor intensive than if you do small scale rooftop solar. So that can vary also in terms of the labor intensity. Finally, I want to put the investment costs in the number into perspective. So I mentioned 1.1 to 1.4 billion that are needed to train, reskill, upskill workers to then be able to work in these sectors. So this is a one-time investment that needs to be done to get those workers up and running. And comparing this to the overall investment just in wind and solar, let alone the entire energy transition. It's actually only a very small fraction, so the entire investment is at least one order of magnitude bigger, if not more. Probably 2 orders of magnitude. So per worker, this breaks down, in the workforce, this comes down to like 10 euros or so if we break it down to the entire workforce. So it's actually a manageable cost. But it's an important cost that needs to be paid or carried out, because if we don't have these workers trained, we are risking not just the wind and solar targets to be missed, but then also the green transition, and this is potentially much more costly for the European economy than just this small number or this number that I'm putting out here. And with this, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Matthias Weitzel for kicking us off in this session. This figure of the 1.1 to 1.4 billion euros needed for the investment in skills really struck me. And this is something that we're going to be discussing in the panel. Then how can we be sure that we unlock these investments? Because otherwise it will indeed be really costly for our economies. Now let's move to the next one of our presentation, presenting evidence from the European Commission's Directorate General for Employment. And I would like to welcome on stage the economic analyst at the European Commission's DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, Nora Vukovic-Bozzi. Welcome.
With many thanks to Matthias for his insightful presentation on the green transition, I will now present findings from a forthcoming DG Employment working paper that analyzes occupations relevant for the digital and green transitions as well as demographic change more broadly. Our paper was produced in cooperation with Eurofound, specifically Agnès Parent-Tirant, who is a senior manager in the Working Life unit, as follow-up to our joint work on the 2023 Employment and Social Developments in Europe report, and builds on our excellent cooperation on working conditions. As we have discussed yesterday and will be discussing today, we are of course all aware that the way we work is changing due to developments associated with the digital and green transitions, as well as demographic change, including as a driver of current and future labor shortages. As these transformations impact job content, tasks, and processes, they will change how people work, the skills needed to carry out the jobs, employment conditions, and ultimately in this way, also dimensions of their job quality. Our joint paper aims to provide some initial evidence on the workforce characteristics, employment conditions, and job dimensions of occupations that are relevant for the outlined 3 transitions. Therefore, we focus on skills, but we also analyze different job characteristics more broadly. So specifically in today's presentation, I will outline very briefly how we measure and identify what we call future-oriented occupations that are relevant to the 3 mentioned transitions. We will then swiftly dive into the results on the workforce and demographic characteristics, their employment conditions, and job dimensions. So to begin with, how we define future-oriented occupations is as jobs that are relevant for up to 3 of either the digital and green transitions and or labor shortages. Hence, these are jobs that are expected to be of importance for the EU economy in the medium to longer term. So how do we do this concretely? To start off with, in the left bar on the slide, for digital occupations, the paper uses the Digital Skills Intensity Index by Mikkel Barslund, whom we will hear from later in the panel of this session, to classify occupations in the EU with different levels of digital skills intensity. Then moving on to green occupations, as we of course know, there is no common and standardized definition for these, and we in this paper use the so-called greening task-based approach and focus on 3 categories of jobs with green tasks. Lastly, to measure current labor shortage occupations, but also those relevant in future, we use a list identified for the proposal of an EU talent pool initiative. So based on these 3 lists, we then construct 9 overarching occupational groups that should help us understand better jobs relevant for the future, but also more importantly, the intersection between them. So this includes, as shown in the left bar of the slide, jobs that are relevant to a single transition. Here we have, as an example, jobs with higher digital skills intensity, and a job typically included in this category would be ICT technicians. Then moving on to the middle section of the slide, we also look at occupations relevant to 2 of the transitions. And here we have, as an example of this, green occupations with increased demand and intermediate to lower digital skills intensity. To make this a bit more palatable, a job included in this category would be electricians needed for solar panel installations, for example. And lastly, we look at jobs relevant to all 3 transitions. Here we have green occupations experiencing labor shortages with different levels of digital skills. And again, here an example would be a car mechanic requiring skills in electrical vehicle repair. We then take these occupational groups and analyze their job characteristics. We do this based on the 2021 European Working Conditions Telephone Survey, as well as Eurostat's EU Labour Force Survey. So now to dive into swiftly the findings of our paper, we found overall that jobs, expectedly so, relevant to the digital and green transitions and labor shortages make up a large share of the workforce. We find that they affect the work performed by 8 out of 10 workers. This underlines, of course, the high relevance and impact of the transitions on the labor market. In terms of skills, we found that a wide range of different skills levels are required. And specifically, a third of so-called future-oriented workers are classified as managers, professionals, technicians, and/or skilled agricultural workers. Then moving on to the demographic characteristics of these jobs, overall, we find that most workers are in the so-called prime or core age group, age 25 to 55. However, the proportion of workers aged 56 and up is higher for certain green occupations as well as labor shortage occupations, and this raises some concern for the demographic renewal within these groups. Similar to what Matthias just presented, gender segregation is also identified in many of our groups, and specifically, as you see highlighted here on the graph, green jobs with labor shortages, largely made up of different types of jobs related to mechanics, transport and construction, as well as agricultural work, are nearly exclusively male-dominated. And occupations with higher digital skills intensity also have a higher proportion of men. On the other hand, we see that critical labor shortage occupations have a higher proportion of female workers. So next, now to move on to the employment and work conditions. When it comes to future-oriented occupations, we found that actually these generally have quite stable employment conditions. As you see here, specifically, digital and green jobs experiencing labor shortages have up to nearly 80% of their workers on permanent contracts. In terms of differences between other groups, we find that also jobs with higher digital skills intensity have quite stable employment relationships. At the same time, again, labor shortage occupations have a higher share of fixed-term contracts of less than a year, and part-time work is also more frequent. Now, moving on, relevant again to discussion on skills, and we have heard yesterday also in the social forum similar numbers quoted on this. Participation in training at EU level is found to be at around 34% for workers who receive training by their employers and 41% who receive on-the-job training. We find that in occupations that are deemed relevant for the future, access to learning new things is actually more common than the EU average. Here, close to half of the workers either receive training provided for by their employer or on-the-job training. And the highest share of training was made available to workers in certain green, new, emerging, and enhanced occupations. And this includes, to give examples, jobs such as life science professionals, physicists, astronomers, and financial analysts. On the other hand, the lowest level of training was provided, again, to workers in critical labor shortage occupations. When looking at more workers who had participated in more recent trainings, so in the last couple of weeks, we found that workers in jobs that require a higher intensity of digital skills also had the most recent trainings. Lastly, we then looked at dimensions of job quality across the future-oriented occupations analyzed, and we did this based on the so-called job strain indicator of the European Working Conditions Telephone Survey, which reflects 6 dimensions of job quality. As you of course know, there is no uniform definition of job quality, and it can be measured using several different indicators. This job quality indicator uses a methodology developed by the OECD that compares job demands, so which affect workers negatively, and job resources, which affect workers positively. When workers have more demands than resources, they experience so-called poorer dimensions of job quality, or as we call it, higher job strain. So overall, here we found that job strain is highest in labor shortage and green occupations with more manual labor-intensive jobs. So this includes train drivers, freight handlers, and crop growers, for example, as shown here. And on the other hand, we found that jobs with higher digital skills intensity have, again, the lowest job strain, also among the highest stable employment relationships. So before we move on to the panel to hear more about skills needs and policy actions related to jobs in future from our panel guests, to leave you with a short recap of key lessons from our analysis. Generally, and perhaps most expectedly, we found that a considerable number of occupations will in some form be impacted as a result of the transitions. These occupations will require vastly different skill levels. So these include jobs that require higher levels of education. Specifically, we talked a lot about digitally intensive jobs today, but also certain green occupations. It will also be made up of workers with lower levels of education, specifically in green jobs, which are more manual labor intensive. We heard it from Matthias, and we found it here as well. Gender segregation is identified in a majority of the occupational groups that we analyze, and in particular, green jobs and digital jobs are more male-dominated, and labor shortage occupations are held by a larger share of females. When we looked at different types of groups, there are of course groups that did much better than others, and here occupations with higher digital skills intensity definitely stand out. They had lower job strain and more stable employment relationships. And this also means that given their expected higher demand, equipping more workers with these skills needed to participate effectively in the digital transition could also potentially enable workers to move into these higher quality jobs. On the other hand, labor shortage occupations and certain more manually labor-intensive green jobs reported higher job strain and safety risks. So with this, thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to the panel.
Thank you very much, Nora, for being with us and for your presentation. I believe it's been really interesting to see the different sectors and how these employment trends come also in terms of the breakdowns of ages, gender, the quality of the jobs as well. So there's definitely a lot of food for thought to bring here into the panel discussion. So let's get straight into it, because I'm also looking forward to it. So I would like to welcome the speakers of our panel discussion on stage. I will introduce each one of them one-on-one, and we will get started with the first questions. So I would like to start by welcoming the expert on skills and labor markets at Cedefop, Konstantinos Pouliakas. Welcome. Konstantinos can join me over here. Next up with us, we have the labor economist at the Directorate General for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs at the OECD, Andrea Garnero. Welcome. That's over here. Then next up with us is the research manager at KU Leuven, Mikkel Barslund. Welcome. And Mikkel, you can choose whether to sit here or here, because we're going to be 5 of us in total. Next up with us is the economist at the European Investment Bank, Michael Stemmer. Welcome. Over here, Michael. Welcome on stage. And last but definitely not the least, we have with us the head of unit at the European Commission's Directorate General for Employment, Social Inclusion, Social Affairs and Inclusion, Elba Bova. Welcome. And Elba, you can join me over here. Excellent. So I would like to start by maybe getting some first reflections on the findings that we've just heard, and maybe how has this resonated with your own findings and your own research and experience. And maybe I would like to start with you, Konstantinos. You represent CEDEFOP, the European Center for Development of Vocational Training. So, complementing the evidence that we have heard from the presentations on skilled needs and employment dimensions, what could you add in terms of new evidence from your second European Skills and Jobs survey? What can you tell us about how have these findings chimed in with your own experience?
Certainly. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, so good morning, very warm welcome to everyone, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to DG Employment, and also I wish to the Commission to break a leg with the new Union of Skills. It's a really important initiative, definitely because after the European Year of Skills, it's sort of ensuring continuity, which is one of the most important things. I think we need to keep the momentum on the discussion on skills and the skills revolution. So I'm Konstantinos Pouliakas. I work at the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training in Thessaloniki, EU's agency. And we have very much been engaged in collecting a lot of data, for instance, with our European Skills and Jobs Survey, which is one of Europe's main surveys collecting information on the skills of European adult workers, the type of demands for skills within their jobs, their participation in continuous training. And a lot of the evidence that we have collected, in particular, with our second wave, which we carried out in 2021 in the midst of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, sort of reinforced that around 42% of the European adult workforce had to learn to use new digital technologies in order to be able to carry out their job tasks. So obviously that was in the midst of the COVID pandemic. We followed up with a very recent AI skills survey that I can talk to you about later on. And we can still see that that's a figure which is quite persistent. You know, you have this percentage of the adult workforce who are very much in jobs which are exposed to the digital transition. And two problems, however, that stand out when we look at this data is the fact that, of course, 4 out of 10 are engaged in such digitally challenged jobs, but you also have a huge part of the European workforce who are either not using computer devices as part of their jobs or are using computer devices, but the type of digital activities that they are asked to carry out are at a relatively basic level. For instance, using word processing software, using Excel spreadsheets, and so on and so forth. Only around 10 to 15% of the European adult workforce are at the moment engaged in what we would call advanced digital activities. Database management, using programming languages to be able to carry out their jobs. We managed to also observe in our data set, of course, that despite the fact that you have on the one side of the labor market this demand for digital skills, digital activities, and we can also see that there is a big wage premium offered to people who are in command of AI technologies and AI skills, there are particular population subgroups such as females, older workers, people in small and medium-sized enterprises, and in particular people who are in what we would call low-quality jobs, jobs with a low level of job complexity, who have very low incentives to continue to invest in the development of their skills. So you end up having this negative feedback loop. People who are basically in jobs which are low-skilled intrinsically, jobs which are involve the execution of basic tasks and basic activities, this self-reinforces this negative cycle. It gives fewer incentives to people to invest in their continuous learning, and thereby you end up having negative productivity dividends in the future. So we need to break, in a sense, that cycle.
This is really interesting, and this is something that we can discuss later on, indeed, to break this vicious circle. I would like to remind everyone in the audience, both of you joining in person and online, by the way, that you'll be able to ask questions to our panelists. We have a Slido ready and open for you. You can connect at slido.com and use the hashtag #EUSocialForum25, or we have the hashtag also popping up in our screens, so you can connect there, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can. So, having said that, going back to the panel, I would like to give the floor now to Andrea, representing the OECD. And I would like to ask, from your perspective, we've been hearing a lot about the main jobs that are going to promote the transition towards climate neutrality. There's been some research presenting both from Matthias and Nora's side. I was wondering if this also resonates with the OECD's own findings. So what are the main jobs that will promote this transition towards climate neutrality, and how is the quality of those jobs?
I think these are indeed key questions, not just from a research perspective, and I think the two presentations before already made a great job in showing the heterogeneity of these jobs. So sometimes we think, at least when we read the press, or maybe some reports, that green jobs are very high-skilled, specialized, good quality, plenty of meaning, and so no problem. Then we should not even be here to talk about, because then everything is fine. In fact, the reality is a bit more complex than that. First of all, the green jobs, whatever defined, we don't have a definition. Nora said it very well. I don't think we will have it anytime soon. But these jobs that contribute and are needed for the transition can be very different. So we can have the very high-skilled wind turbine engineers or carbon trade analysts, but we also have a number of jobs that exist since many decades, maybe centuries, like plumbers, who are becoming greener. They were installing fuel heating system yesterday, they are installing a heat pump today, so their tasks and skills are evolving. And then there are group of workers, and a big chunk of workers whose tasks is not even really changing. So I think they were mentioned before: construction workers, drivers, because if you want to build a wind turbine, okay, you need the engineer, you need the electricity specialist, but you also need cement, which is not green at all. You need construction workers, you need drivers who may not be that green, but you need that. And that's very important from a, let's say, DG Employment, Labor Ministry point of view, because if you're concerned about delivering the green transition, you cannot concentrate just on the narrow group of high-skilled, relatively well-paid workers, but you need to take into account the entire value chain. If you have the engineers, but you don't have the drivers, you don't build the wind turbine. And briefly on the job quality, I think Nora already said it all, but the story is more nuanced then. If we look at the larger group of workers, then it means that in fact, yes, there are some well-paid workers with a decent job security, but there are also many others where job quality is not good. Let me give you the most telling and anecdotal, let's say the most telling example. One of the most important green job is the one of waste disposal and recycling. And this is a job that unfortunately is still very much done manually, extremely hazardous, touching things that can cut people or brave dangerous elements. And this is not well paid, it's dangerous, often poor job security, and yet it's a key green job. And it's an example. There are other less extreme examples, but there we have a concern, because if we are asking people to move on to do more green jobs, but these jobs will require, maybe we'll come back later, but will require some training, in some cases significant training, so some effort by the people, and to end up in a job that at the end of the day is less good than the one that people had before, then let's not be surprised that we have shortages and we have pushback.
Definitely, that's very interesting. And I think something that you mentioned at the beginning, I think we thought, those of us working in the energy transition, that the question of purpose by itself would be leading more people to join the green jobs and reskill. But the picture is much more nuanced than that, as as you mentioned. So thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to Mikkel Barslund, because we've actually just heard in today's presentation about the concept of digital skills intensity. I even saw one of your papers also mentioned by Nora indeed just before. So given your research on that, what do you think can be said and can be added around educational and especially regional disparities across EU member states when it comes to digital skills?
Thanks a lot. And also thanks a lot for the invitation to be here. Nora was, of course, way too kind in mentioning me, because her work with co-authors go way beyond what I did. But before I answer your question, I would like to pick up from the previous thing you mentioned, Andrea, that what I took away from the two presentation was, I think it was the same, but a slightly different note. You said that many jobs will stay the same. Indeed, I agree with this. But I also took away from the presentation that many jobs are affected by the changes we have. So not just the green transition, but also the digital transition, and indeed the widespread shortages there are. So I think that's another takeaway, that actually many jobs are affected by these transitions. So now to your question. Well, I think what we found in our research was that there are quite wide disparities in digital skills intensities across regions in the EU. I think that would probably what we expected when we started the research. I think the kind of bright spot is that in every member state there is certainly one or two or even more clusters of very high digital intensity. So it's not that it's missing from some member states or missing from some area completely. There's also the question about whether you should expect the same digital skills level or the same digital skills intensity in each region in the EU. I don't think so, because there are many differences in industry structure, which would mean that some regions will be more digital skills intensive. We know that digital skills intensive jobs are more often kind of knowledge workers closer to higher education institutions, so they will be more urbanly concentrated. I think what would be important, and what Nora and co-authors couldn't do because they don't have the data for it, is to try to compare on an occupational basis. So are jobs, the same kind of jobs in rural areas, are they less digital and skills intensive than those jobs being in urban areas? So to look at whether rural areas are lagging behind within the same jobs. But for this, we would need another kind of data. I think I'll keep it at this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mikkel. And now from Mikkel to Michael. So I wanted to pick up on one of the questions that has already come up in the presentations, which is the question of skill shortages, both when we look at the digital and the green transitions. And I wanted to ask you then, how can the skill shortages be alleviated? How do you think we can bridge these gaps? Because I mean, as we said, it's good to at the end of the day cost the European economy and our energy and digital transitions actually quite a lot.
No, you're absolutely right. So first of all, thanks for the invitation, and thank you for the very pertinent question, quite timely. In particular, as we have yesterday, we had the occasion at the EIB Forum in Luxembourg to launch our new EIB investment report, Innovation, Integration and Simplification in Europe, where we actually have an entire chapter dedicated to social investment and how to alleviate the skill shortages which we face. And I think I would even go actually much further than just looking at green digital skills, also in light of the demographic transition, but talking about skills across the life cycle. Because what we see, and I think these are actually the three main approaches which we need to take, which is first of all, when we want to alleviate the skill shortages and the lack of skills, both firms and also municipalities actually feel, as our surveys on the investment survey, but also on the municipality survey, which we are actually doing on an annual basis, and which has also come out. First of all, We actually need to reskill and upskill existing workers in the workforce. We need to get our basic education right, because we have like many young people who are actually leaving the education system prematurely. We're currently at around the 10% level of young people that are early leavers from the school system. And we have around 13% of people that are young people, that are neither in education nor in training. And this is something, this is simply like we cannot afford given the strong skill shortages we're actually feeling everywhere. And the third approach is actually mobilizing people of accessing the labor force. So we're talking about women. First of all, I think women, when we actually look at labor force participation, women have actually been among the group of people that have actually increased their participation tremendously over the last couple of years, particularly at an older age. But at the same time, also disabled people or people from disadvantaged backgrounds. These are simply people we simply cannot leave behind. And in order to do this, we first of all actually need to look at how we actually generally increase the qualification of our education systems in primary, secondary schooling. This includes infrastructure, but also teacher training, for instance, in terms of digital skills, screen skills, and so on. We actually need to increase participation of on-the-job training. Only 12% at the moment of adults in the workplace are either actively trained or are seeking actively training. And this is way too little, given the big shortage of skills and also the retirement of the baby boomer generation, which basically by 2030 will be completely retired. And the third aspect is we actually need to decrease structural barriers in the labor force in order to allow women, and particularly involuntary part-time workers, to actually take up full-time jobs. We estimate, for instance, in the investment report that up to 1.5 million new childcare places would have the gender employment gap, which we had in 2023. Of course, this actually needs a tremendous amount of investments. The EIB does a lot, and we stand ready to do more. Now, just to give you one figure, over the last 5 years, the European Investment Group invested over 9.7 billion euros in supporting the education systems, both in infrastructure, but also in subsidized loans for students, means-tested housing, and so on. So it simply takes a lot. But at the same time, apart from investments, it also requires more flexibility from the employers as well, in terms of flexible working time, but also a better coordination between the employers, the public education providers, and the private sector education providers, in order to provide targeted and tailored training for people on the job, in order to be prepared for the triple transitions we're currently going through.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think you've brought several important dimensions, the gender segregation dimension, and how do we indeed, again, bridge this gap, the question of inclusion, that we cannot leave anyone behind, and I'm sure the other panelists will have a lot to say and to react on that. Before that, I would like to give the floor to Elva Bova, Head of Unit at the European Commission at DG Employment. We've been hearing very interesting insights on the type of jobs needed for the future, the different breakdowns across age, gender, and also the quality of these jobs. And now, so based on these findings, I'm very curious to understand what is the European Commission doing about it to anticipate, to address these impacts on the labor market?
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, it's a pleasure for me to give a perspective based on the policies of the European Commission, and it's an extreme challenge to do it in 2-3 minutes. So with respect to skills, a lot has been done. Most initiatives, well, some initiatives started already 10 years ago, but many of the initiatives have been implemented within the framework of the Pillar for Social Rights. I'm talking about the European Skills Agenda, the Years of Skills, the Pact for Skills, initiatives that try to enhance at the level of the member states policies to upskilling, reskilling the workforce, trying to improve the matching between labor supply and labor demand, and clearly increasing the talent. Then more recently, in some digital hiccup. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. More recently, we also were very concerned about labor shortages, and this has been amply discussed, not just the skill shortages, and we try to address both shortages in terms of skills and labor with an action plan launched and proposed last March, so March 2024, which besides addressing issues in terms of skills, upskilling and reskilling, also tries to increase the workforce. And we discussed amply about the challenges, demographic challenges that we will face in the next years. So one main focus of the action plan is indeed, as the colleague from the EIB mentioned, attracting, activating a population or groups of the population that are outside the labor force, women, migrants, but also attracting talent from abroad. And then I'm not going to touch about the Union of Skills. This has been amply discussed. But one point still on the skills is that whenever we propose policies and we announce really and we present initiatives to be implemented jointly with the social partners and the member states, there is also a co-financing that is established through the European Social Fund. And on this, let me give you some numbers. For the programming, for the financial period 2020-2027, the EU, through the European Social Fund Plus, has allocated around a third of the total envelope, corresponding to 43 billion, to knowledge, education and skills. Within this, 15 billion are for adult learning programs and initiatives. This is what I would say with respect to skills, and then maybe a little bit more about working conditions. A lot has been done in this respect, many initiatives, the directive on minimum wage, directive and legal initiatives on working time, health and safety at work. But what I would like to mention also, which has already been discussed briefly yesterday, is a new initiative planned for the beginning of 2026 on the quality of jobs. This will be a quality of jobs roadmap, which will emphasize fairness of wages, trying to enhance collective bargaining, and then clearly improve working conditions. And maybe I finish here, but there is a lot more that can be said. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elva. Indeed, very difficult to summarize all the actions from the Commission's front in just a couple of minutes, but you gave us a very good taste about how is it already addressing these transitions and the impact on the labor market. So I already got some first questions on Slido, and I would want to encourage everyone to keep the questions coming using slido.com and the hashtag #EUSocialForum25, or the hashtag that just popped up back here on the screen. Because there are two questions that I see that are very similar to one another, which is, I think the audience wants to also understand in practice which skills are we talking about, which are the skills that will be most relevant in the future. We have a question that explicitly asks that, and another one that says, do we have data that forecast which skills will be most relevant in the future? I think we have a different expertise here when it comes to green and digital transition, so we can maybe try to tackle both. I don't know if maybe Konstantinos also, since you've already gone quite deep into the AI skills perspective, maybe you can give us some thoughts on that.
So, I mean, I think I can come into this question also, taking a little bit of a historical step back, which is that, I mean, the European Union has invested a lot in trying to develop its skill anticipation infrastructure for over 10, 15 years now. For instance, CEDEFOP had the important role of developing the European skills forecasting mechanism all the way back, starting back in 2005. So, this is one of the main sort of tools where we manage to try to understand what is likely to be the growth in employment in different sectors, occupations in European economies in the next 10 to 15 years, done with a systematic methodology. But of course, its major constraint has always been that because of the type of data that we had available, its implications about skill needs in the future tends to be about what type of levels of qualifications people are going to need. You know, if they're going to need high tertiary level qualifications, medium, low level of qualifications. So we initiated, we made a big effort beginning 2010, where we tried to explore what the alternative type of information can we have, which is more granular on skills. And this is what gave birth to the Skills of 8 tool, the online vacancy analysis tool for Europe that Cedefop developed and now has been passed over to Eurostat so that the European Union can start producing actual statistics on the degree of skill demand. And by skills, we're now talking about granular skills, being able to understand the extent to which, in particular occupations, you need to have a good knowledge of digital skills at different levels, critical thinking, creative thinking, and so on and so forth. By looking at this tremendous, rich type of data set, and imagine that now in the past 7 or 8 years, we have basically web scraped over 1 billion of online job vacancies across all European countries. And I think the picture that always stands out is that there, you know, if you try to focus and try to see where are the marginal changes, digital skills, advanced digital skills, demand for AI-level skills are now experiencing a sort of hiccup. You can see that more and more occupations are mentioning the terms related to AI skills. In terms of green skills, given the fact that we would like to link it with the presentations, there are increasingly terms related to demand for environmental sustainability, but not to the same extent as with the digital transition. It is something which, of course, comes down to the fact that there is a smaller share of sectors, as was shown to us in the presentation, which are very much affected by the green transition, less so than the digital transition, which is on a much more widespread level. So if you want to sort of assess to what extent there's changing skill demands across different occupations, I think it's pretty obvious that you can see that there is an increasing demand for digital skills, but even when you're talking about demand for AI skills, these are highly complementary with what we tend to call soft skills. So data scientists, data analysts who are now increasingly in demand in our labor markets, who are now commanding wage premiums in the order of 10, even up to 20%. What is distinguishing their jobs and their prospects in the labor market is the fact that they seem to be doing a good job in combining this very high and sophisticated technical knowledge of machine learning techniques, deep learning techniques, with an ability to communicate and convey these analyses and these patterns that they observe in the data well to businesses. So they also have a good level of communication skills. They also have a good level of problem-solving skills. And this is the sort of mix that is helping people stand out in labor markets of today. Also feeding into skill shortages and labor shortages, because that is, let's say, the crux, that is the core of the workforce that European businesses need at the moment to be able to continue to invest, to be competitive, to be able to innovate. That is the pool of people that we will need increasingly to try to invest in future years.
Thank you. Thanks, Konstantinos. Who else would want to add to this response?
Just maybe one point on the fact that this must become a process, not an end goal. So it's not a one-shot exercise of forecasting skills. This must be a continuous exercise, because we have jobs that exist today and were not existing even just 3, 4, 5 years ago. And here, of course, when we talk about skills, it's a long-term prospect. We have initial education, continuous vocational training, continuing training. So it's not something that we do today and we immediately see it in the reality. So I think it's really this role of skills anticipation exercises is very important. So OECD member states, EU countries do these kind of exercises, but in the framework of the green transition, this is still somewhat complicated by changing objectives and regulations. So it's not obvious to see where we are going. And the second is that taxonomies, definitions, and so on are also a moving target, and that's complicated. But indeed, I think more than for other transitions, this is a key responsibility for policymakers, because we can claim that globalization, digitalization, whatever is more for act of God, whereas the climate targets are not act of God. They have been decided by policymakers, so voters know that they can potentially go faster or slower by voting. And one responsibility is to provide precise guidance on this. So I think this is where certainly the European Commission at the EU level has done better than other member countries in better integrating the social and skills dimension in the climate targets. So often we still see too much that this is just in the hands of climate environmental ministries, and the social skills aspect is an afterthought. But if you don't have the right skills and if you don't have the social acceptability, you will not deliver on the climate targets, which are the responsibility of the environmental ministry.
Thanks, Andrea. Elva, and then I move on to the next question.
Yes, so although I said I will not go and talk about the Union of Skills, there is a point to say that was mentioned yesterday by our Executive Vice President, that one of the enablers of this strategy is indeed data forecasting, because we need really to have information about future skills needs as fast as possible. So there's one of these enablers is indeed the creation of a EU Skills Observatory, which would allow us to understand the needs of the future.
Thanks a lot, Elva. And also based on that, because one of the questions that has already come up also from the presentations is the need to invest in the skills for the future. Just for the green transition alone, we had the estimates of 1.1 between 1.1 and 1.4 billion, which, yeah, if we put it into perspective, doesn't seem that much, no, the 10 euro per person, but we still need it, otherwise it's going to be very costly for our economies. So perhaps my question is, how do we make sure that we unlock these investments, and these investments go to the where should these investments go? And I don't know if for instance, like Michael would have something to say about that, or who would want to respond to this question.
That's actually a good question. Where it is supposed to go? Well, when talking from a European Investment Bank perspective, right? I already mentioned a number before, which actually has been going into the education sector throughout the last 5 years. But we are a demand-driven institution, right? So basically, when we are approached either by municipalities, by regional state actors, or also by sovereign, also by nation states, we are basically evaluating the projects that are presented to us, right? It's, I mean, what we have been doing so far is, as already I've alluded to, is actually a plethora of things. Of course, a big chunk of what we're doing goes into infrastructure investment, right? So basically upgrading digital infrastructure, upgrading schools, basically allowing for a better learning and teaching environment for everyone, which I think is essential. But at the same time, it also goes into means-tested student housing, grants for subsidized student loans, in Hungary, for instance, or campuses for VET training in Finland. So these are examples where we are active. And I think it's really difficult to really pinpoint one particular aspect, one particular sector where the money should go, but it requires, I would even say, a systemic perspective, a comprehensive perspective, because as we see, money is basically lacking everywhere so far, and we need both a push in infrastructure investment in order to allow teaching and a learning experience that is fit for the future, but at the same time also try to actually bring education to those people that are more disadvantaged and that we simply cannot leave behind.
Thank you. And then related to that, because we've been discussing a lot on the need for investments in skills for the green transition and the benefits that it's going to bring. We're going to be deploying renewables faster. They should bring prices of energy prices down and reduce energy independence, which then will be much better for our economies overall. I'm just curious to understand also who's going to be benefiting the most from investing in AI, from investing in digital skills overall. So Mikkel, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it depends a bit going back to what you said, that we need a systemic approach. I think it depends on how you structure it. No, if you structure investment in digital skills and AI skills, if you structure that alone as, say, subsidized to companies, I think I would fear it would go only to people who already have quite good skills and will have more. So I think we need to have a structure where you put some of this money into to clear bottlenecks, as where there really is need on the labor market, where these skills are needed. But I also think that part of it have to go into more lifelong learning. So maybe skills that we don't anticipate or that person will not need right now on the labor market, but maybe learning to operate a particular app can be beneficial in the future, where kind of lifelong learning is more not learning right now for something right specific, but learning the whole life. And some of these skills that you learn and that is invested in you might not need them in the labor market, or at least not directly, but other skills you will. So I think it's important. That's not very concrete, but I think it's important to both address immediate labor market needs, what it needed. Machine learning specialists who can program large language models certainly needed, but also other types of digital skills which are not immediately needed in the labor market.
Okay, Mikael, very, very briefly.
Very quickly, yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think the versatility of skills, particularly for actually creating a future-proof younger generation that actually is able to adapt to an ever more dynamic labor market, is necessary. And for that, STEM skills are of the essence. And unfortunately, we see across the board that the STEM skills are actually, that the take-up of people studying and graduating from STEM skills is actually been going down, and it's something that needs to be eased and improved.
Thank you, and I can allow a quick reaction
I just
from Andrea.
wanted to react. Michael before said that money, of course, is missing, or money is always missing. But I think on training and skills, I think not necessarily. In a sense, there is still a lot that we can do to improve what we provide in terms of the quality of the training. In many cases, there is no quality assurance mechanism. I'm sorry to say, but in many cases, there are random training done just because it's a business. And so this is something where we can act without necessarily new money, or aligning training offers with training demand. We see catalogs of training which have nothing to do with what is demanded at the local level. So, of course, I agree, I'm being a bit provocative, but just to say that I think there are, let's say, efficiency gains, we could call it, that we can still make it.
Thank you. And I wanted to connect this point with another one of the questions that we got on Slido, which says, skills are, of course, critical. They are the outcome of a learning process. So how do our education and training systems need to change to respond? So to which extent are our education systems catching up with the reality of our labor markets? And I know, Elva, you wanted to react. So
I can do that later.
Okay,
yeah.
super. Because related to that, I wanted to maybe ask a question to Constantino, since you represent the, since you are involved in the field of vocational education and training. To which extent our VET institutions are catching up with the demands of the labor market and of our societies in general? I remember not so long ago, someone was telling me that in some electric vocational trainings, they were still teaching people to operate coal-based systems and not so much renewable and grid-based. So I'm curious to understand, how do you see that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, your question comes very much at the heart of what Cedefop does and why Cedefop exists, in a sense, which is, I mean, the answer to that is that if there is a part of the educational system that is in alignment, more so with what are the needs of the labor market, that is the vocational education and training system. And there has been tremendous progress, I think, in the past decade or so in European VET systems. Of course, with the great financial recession and the alliances for apprenticeship and so on and so forth, there was a renewed impetus for VET systems in Europe, and it's a continuous struggle. We need to take into account that there are tremendous problems in many European countries with VET schools in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of the fact that they are starting from a relatively second-based position compared to higher level education. VET schools were always sort of treated as, you know, the poor cousin of the educational system in many EU countries. But in particular in many countries like in Southern Europe, there have been tremendous improvements. I can talk, for instance, for my own country in Greece, where you had the Minister of Labor yesterday making an intervention. There's been tremendous investments in vet schools. There's been a renewed interest in vet schools. And I think what is increasingly, let's say the point that we're increasingly trying to make is that we tend to compare vet schools with general schools. That's a wrong comparison to make. Vet schools are there to attract people who are many times coming from very difficult, challenging socioeconomic backgrounds. They are the type of educational environments that are typically more attuned to catering to these challenging people, to dropouts, to people who are, for instance, NEETs that was mentioned previously. And what we can also now increasingly see is that vet schools are becoming a key avenue, even for adults, even for higher educated people who are basically finding it increasingly difficult to enter into the labor market, into jobs which are matched with the type of skills that they have. So they are really second chance opportunities. And you can make the decision even at a relatively older age to try to fine-tune the type of career you have, the type of skill set that you have attained through a vocational education training schools. Having said that, as I mentioned, there are big disparities, from the countries in the northern, even central of Europe, where vet has been traditionally a core part of the educational system, to particular Southern European countries where you have less than a third of young students who are entering into vet schools, and we are trying to increase that in alignment with the EU goals and EU ambitions. So I'm happy to see, and I will conclude with this, I'm happy to see that in the Union of Skills, something that Cedefop has been asking for a long time now, which is to try to initiate, if not formally, but at least in terms of the pillars of what was a Bologna process for higher education, but to try to put and set in motion a Bologna process for vocational education and training in Europe, which is challenging because the EU doesn't have the, let's say, the main responsibility for education training systems, but nevertheless, we can try to stimulate and spur that discussion and those endeavors among the member states.
Thank you, Konstantinos. Elva, you wanted to react before.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on the point raised by Andrea regarding the trainings and the policies that need to be implemented to improve skills. I think as of now, something that we are working on is really trying to understand which policy works and which policy doesn't work, and also not only about the effectiveness of policies, but the cost effectiveness of policies, because we have an array of tools that have been deployed, but really we need to nail down and try to understand which one is effective in a specific context, in a specific member state. And the only way to go about that is to build up capacity in terms of policy evaluations in the national administrations. This cannot be an academic exercise. It has to be done regularly anytime a policy is implemented, ex ante and ex post. And it's something we're doing quite extensively with some member states, jointly with the OECD, where we study a policy and we try to do counterfactual impact evaluations and see whether this has worked to enhance skills, to enhance job opportunities. Otherwise, we really remain in the dark of what's really effective.
Any additional points or reactions? Otherwise, I'll move to the next question, because it brings back the question of not leaving anyone behind. It's the most voted question that I see on Slido so far. And they asked to please share some ideas to increase green and digital skills in vulnerable groups, so with low professional qualifications, or people losing their jobs over 50 years old. So what are perhaps some ideas or some best practices maybe that we might bring to the table? Who would want to start?
I can have a go. Let's say, I think this is the key challenge. Let's say we say skills, 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 but the reality, Michael, Matthias before gave the numbers, is still a relatively dire one. So 10–20% of people train at most, and usually, and this was said in the panel that was sitting here before, these are more the high skilled rather than the low skilled. So in fact, investment in skills may in fact widen inequalities instead of decreasing inequalities. So I think This is the key policy challenge, how to bring the people most exposed. We know that people in emission-intensive sectors train less, people most exposed to automation train less, low-skilled people train less. So that's the key issue. So what we see, let's say, I cannot say that we have plenty of extremely successful examples because it's tough, not because people are not trying, but because it's obviously tough. If I may just say something in a few seconds, differently from something on top, let's say, what is being done, I think we should focus more on the more, let's call them, I don't know, psychological barriers, subjective barriers to training. So some people do not train because they haven't been in school for 20, 30 years, and so they think they cannot learn. Some people, they do not train and do not want to train for a green job because they do not identify with that job. They see construction, no, construction is not for me, I'm not doing that. Even though we saw it before, many construction jobs are white-collar jobs. So there is an information gap, and in some cases a motivation gap. So there is a key essential role of officials, caseworkers in public employment services, not just in handling the paperwork. Okay, you are looking for a job, give me your name, your address, and so on and so forth. But there is a personal engagement that must take place. These require resources and investments in the caseworkers themselves to break these psychological barriers, which is also something that for the time being we do not really measure, but that in my view do play a role as much as the usual barriers that we say, time, money, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Andrea. I think Mikkel, you want to go?
Yes, quickly, if I may come in. I also want to allude to what actually was already said. I think, first of all, we have quite a lot of interesting examples across European countries, which I think we can tap on. This ranges from, on the one hand, a better integration of the schooling system with private companies, particularly at the regional level, where actually, where these collaboration programs are tailored and are tailored to the job needs of the firms. And at the same time, which also comes back from evidence from our survey, that actually 77% of European firms are actually claiming that skill shortages are a major long-term investment barrier for them. At the same time, the share of firms that are training and the amounts that are spent per firm and employee on training have actually remained basically flat throughout the last decade. And this is something that has to change, which brings me back to the on-the-job training. So it's also the responsibility of both the private sector, the companies, the public education sector, and the private training providers to actually integrate better and provide trainings that are better integrated and targeted in order to provide training and skills for future jobs and future changes.
Thank you, Mikkel. Elva, you wanted to...
I just wanted to mention that with respect to the topic of who's left behind, a lot has been done also within the context of the Just Transition Fund, still a policy of the European Commission, really to facilitate this transition and try to avoid a split between winners and losers. There is much that's been done also in the Net Zero Industry Act. But to come back also to a point that was raised yesterday by our Vice President, there is an issue of mindset there. And how do we reach that? How do we reach out to the mindset? How do we break it through that? So accessibility to public employment services is key, and try to make sure that there is a constant dialogue, but this is very costly, of course, between them and those vulnerable groups. And another important point is vulnerable groups are very heterogeneous. Some have specific barriers that differ from the others. We're talking about women, we're talking about migrants, persons with disabilities. So really, what is important is to adapt these services to these specific vulnerabilities.
Thank you very much, Elva. With this message, I believe we can wrap up the discussion. There's so much more we could have still talked about, but I think this makes a, that's a very important message that we have to, that we can bring, I believe, from this discussion. The fact that we have these three transitions coming together, the digital, the green transition, but also demographic transition in front of us. We need to speed up and to adapt to it. There's important investments needed for that, especially to ensure precisely that all vulnerable groups and underrepresented groups are not left behind. But there's some promising developments also in terms of policies that, that can make us hopeful to be sure that, that we have those skills for a competitive Europe, as the title of of this event says it. So thank you very much to our panelists. If I can ask for a big round of applause for them.
Thank you.
So our session now has come to an end, so it's time to enjoy the lunchtime. For those of you who are joining us here in Brussels, you can move to the lunch area, also I believe where the coffee break were taking place, to get some well-deserved lunch. Those of you joining online, I hope you also get time to stretch your legs and get some fresh air. And see you for the next sessions.